Hello there, this is James of ScraftyJames1978, and late last year I made a video links down into Underbar dissecting Trump's victory, onto the end of which I added an 18-minute long video by Innuendo Studios, also links down into Underbar, which I will be paraphrasing here, because regardless of whether we're talking about Gamergate, Make America Great Again, self-proclaimed rationalists and skeptics on YouTube attacking triggered special snowflakes, or the rise of the far right across Europe, the underlying psychology of regressive reactionary tribalism and the willingness of I'm not bigoted but, particularly but not exclusively, straight, white and cisgendered men to throw everyone else under the bus because they feel threatened by change, fear losing their privilege, or even simply feel uncomfortable are always exactly the same. And to demonstrate this, I will now essentially recite the original video by Innuendo Studios, quoting it verbatim as much as possible, but changing the nouns and context wherever necessary, bearing in mind that I will be using the term Make America Great Again to describe not Trump's official campaign, at least not specifically, but rather the coalition of alt-right trolls, Tea Party activists and Russian propagandists who, like the core of Gamergate, made this whole absurd nightmare possible. The question of what was Make America Great Again even is typically framed as, was it a populist grassroots movement of forgotten Americans taking back their country from the liberal coastal elites, immigrants, special interest groups and globalization, or was it a racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, Islamophobic, white supremacist and authoritarian hate mob using the legitimate anger of the quote-unquote forgotten people as a smokescreen? But even that is framing the question in Make America Great Again's terms. For the people who knew what Make America Great Again was but did not participate in it, what Make America Great Again described as the liberal elites, regressive leftists and masses brainwashed by mainstream media, but was really just the entire rest of the world, the question was Make America Great Again openly fascist, or just a bunch of frustrated voters misdirecting their rage? And that was really a question of proportion. Put another way, to what extent did Make America Great Again know that it was a racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, Islamophobic, white supremacist and authoritarian hate mob? No one has exact numbers on Make America Great Again, mainly because it used sock accounts and bots to artificially swell its numbers, and it's impossible to know how many were simply paid Russian trolls, but it seemed to shake out into two groups, one small and one large. The first group wasn't necessarily interested in the plight of the forgotten people, Benghazi, Hillary's emails, the Clinton Foundation, or what have you, but found them to be a useful cover when calling for entire demographics to be stripped of their human rights. The second group, which by all accounts was much larger, was where we found the majority of Trump voters, the people who sincerely believed that there was something bad about Hillary, Obama, the Democrats, the mainstream media, the establishment in general, and in many cases globalization, and were sincerely angry about it, but spent most of their time with Make America Great Again instead of meaningfully discussing the issues or doing their own research to learn that no matter how bad Hillary may have been, Trump and Make America Great Again were at least 10 times worse, talking about how they weren't a part of the first group, how there was nothing they could do about the first group, and how unfair it was to dismiss everything that they had to say about Hillary, Obama, the Democrats, and the establishment because of the first group's bigoted conspiracy theories and propaganda, since they weren't at all responsible for them. But the first group was Make America Great Again. This was the group that, before Trump had ever even decided to run for president, had spread birtherism, the paranoid fear that Obamacare would create death panels and lead to genocide, declared liberalism to be a mental illness and the Sandy Hook massacre to be a false flag, declared that Islam was at war with Western civilization, lamented that by 2050 white people would be a minority in the US and Western Europe, blamed most, if not all, crime on black people and illegal immigrants, and everything else from Breitbart.com, InfoWars and Fox News that would end up being the basis of Trump's entire worldview, if not openly chanted as part of his presidential campaign, including vilifying and demonizing Hillary to the point of absurd and grotesque parody. Indeed, it was the first group which persuaded Trump to make Lock Her Up a key platform of his election campaign, a position which Trump admitted in a rally after his election that he was openly contemptuous of. But while attacking Hillary simply for being a woman would have been a bridge too far, if they denounced and condemned her as a criminal and worse, as the personification of the establishment which they could burn in effigy, suddenly moderating abuse and slander gets framed as censorship, and presenting that appearance of being the noble defenders of democracy opposing a corrupt criminal and an even more corrupt establishment depends upon bringing in true believers, people who believe what you say even when you yourself don't. Crooked Hillary, lock her up, drain the swamp, bring manufacturing jobs back to the US, Mexico will pay for the wall, and all of Trump's other slogans and catchphrases were selected specifically to appeal to the disillusioned, the directionless, the impoverished, and the people who were angry at being left behind. People who'd seen their communities decaying for decades, their quality of life becoming worse and worse, horror stories about illegal immigrants, black street gangs, and Islamic terrorists on the news, along with round-the-clock speculation about Hillary's godforsaken emails. People who were nervous about how the world was changing and wanted a boogeyman to blame for it all, who were either ignorant or desperate enough to believe that Trump's delusional pipe dreams could somehow improve their lives in defiance of all reality, logic, and common sense, looking for any excuse to throw a hand grenade at Capitol Hill and fuck with the people who fucked with them, or worse, merely a justification for their not regressive or reactionary not racism, misogyny, or xenophobia. The first group of neo-Nazis, Klan members and other white supremacists, misogynists, Islamophobes, internet trolls, Tea Party activists and Russian propagandists were not a fringe group of shitty people who infiltrated Trump's noble grassroots campaign to make America great again. It was their movement. The people who couldn't vote for Hillary because she was corrupt, voted to bring jobs back to the US, or believed Trump's delusional lie that his fictional healthcare plan would cover everybody and cost them less every single year, were the ones who aligned themselves with them. So what did the two groups want? What did they achieve? And what did they each gain from allying with the other side? Well, on the face of it, that last question is pretty basic. They deflected criticism for each other. Criticise a member of the first group for being a white supremacist, misogynist, or Islamophobe, and they just melt into the crowd of the second group saying, we're a legitimate movement. I'm not spreading racist, Islamophobic, misogynist, anti-immigrant propaganda, which was probably provided by the Russians. I'm just trying to make America great again, and the second group would believe and defend them. Criticise a member of the second group for their arguments, and they'd say, you just won't take me seriously because you think I'm a part of the first group. This was the completely symbiotic relationship between the majority of Trump voters and the core of Make America Great Again. Without it, the movement would have burned itself out along with Trump's presidential campaign within a couple of months, and the would-be Trump voters could have spent 10 minutes on Snopes or PolitiFact discovering that everything they believed about Hillary was at best grossly exaggerated and based on fallacies and conspiracy theories. And what did Make America Great Again want? The short answer is war. They wanted to destroy the other wherever they found it, a desire which, as I mentioned earlier, predated Trump's presidential campaign by a long way. The core of Make America Great Again and today of Trump's support base as president doesn't want to live in a diverse, equal, liberal society in which being a white Christian man no longer carries any privilege, but also knows that they don't actually have the power to prevent one from coming to exist. However, what they do have is the power to impede it, to disrupt progress, to wrap bigotry in a bunch of political euphemisms to make it more culturally acceptable. This is a war in the Norse mythology sense, a war which cannot be won, but that can be prolonged. And although Trump is so delusional and incompetent and the GOP in Congress is so hopelessly divided that they've had to invent a new conspiracy theory of the deep state in which Obama is still running everything from a bunker a couple of miles away from the White House, in an, I'm going to assume, mostly subconscious way, this actually works in their favour. Since if they manage to destroy all of their targets, then they'd have to find new ones to take their places, because that's how a persecution complex works. You have to keep your persecutors around. It's how you define yourself. It's how you pretend that they have power over you and that you're now taking it back. If they can't dig up anything bad enough with which to smear their imagined persecutors, then they simply make something up instead. And the most upsetting thing is that this works, at least some of the time. Studies show that reactionary comments can change how the public responds to a piece of media. It's why Popular Science turned off comments on their site. This intentional polarization from small minorities within a community is largely what movements like Make America Great Again are for, to react so negatively as to make a reasonable position seem like the far end of the spectrum, and to make the halfway point between reasonable and bugfuck irrational the new moderate position. And this new quote-unquote moderate position was the niche carved out for the second group, the Trump voters who may have had their misgivings and told themselves that he wouldn't be able to accomplish his most extreme neo-fascist agenda, but still convinced themselves that Hillary would have been worse. What this second group wanted from Make America Great Again, though, assuming that they didn't simply vote as an act of protest, was complicated. Their difficulty was that they couldn't admit publicly, or even to themselves, that what they and the worst elements of Make America Great Again essentially wanted was the same things. They need to believe that they are the good guys, girls or others, even if they themselves were Hispanic lesbian feminists, at least one of whom I'm certain must have voted for Trump, probably in Florida. 99 times out of 100, they were motivated by the belief that America was heading down the wrong path, that the 1% and the establishment were exploiting the whole nation, and sooner or later this would lead to catastrophe. So even if things weren't better back in the good old days, in inverted commas, they were at least stable, and thus these voters were willing to give power back to a rich white man in the hopes of regaining that stability. Women for Trump, blacks for Trump, Muslims for Trump, gays for Trump, Jews for Trump, Latinas for Trump, and on and on and on. Every single one of them was basically saying, okay, I'm a part of the group which Make America Great Again is actively attacking, if not outright demonizing, as the single cause of America's downfall. But what you've got to understand is that it's only because things have gone too far. We're letting in too many of the bad ones, or allowing the bad ones to dictate the agenda. So we have to go back to the way we imagine things used to be, never actually saying, but I'm one of the good ones, although they may as well have carried signs declaring that to be the case. And obviously, when we point this out to them, they look around for a reason to dismiss us, and no one has a longer list of reasons to dismiss regressive leftist feminazi SJW snowflakes than the people who made those terms derogatory slurs long before they became the core of Make America Great Again. Of course, if Trump voters wanted to maintain the self-righteous conceit that they were the good guys, girls or others and were not bigoted but, then they couldn't condone or actively participate in the most blatant harassment, abuse, slander or dissemination of bigoted conspiracy theories and propaganda. However, they didn't exactly lose sleep over the fact that it was happening, and if it had turned out that Trump had been able to ban all Muslims, deport all undocumented brown migrants, and redouble the police's war against people of colour, violate human rights on a scale not seen since World War II, then they wouldn't really have lost sleep over that either, and Make America Great Again was smart enough to feed them reassurance that their token I'm not bigoted but lip service, and where appropriate there, I can't be bigoted because I'm an insert token demographic here, was literally the best that they could do, and make them believe it. This was the dance of Make America Great Again, and all other alt-right were not white supremacist, were just opposing the liberal agenda, not neo-Nazi, but persuading others to dedicate themselves to your cause by constantly reassuring them that they're nothing like you. So they handed disillusioned voters a spook story about American carnage. A solid theory should be constructed like a table, an explanation supported by sturdy points of evidence or legs. In this case, the assertion that illegal immigrants, NAFTA and globalization in general were the reason why American workers were losing their jobs, that immigrants, refugees, Muslims and people of colour in general were responsible for most, if not all, crime, terrorism and America's drug problem, and were simply able to waltz into the US without let or hindrance, that Hillary was responsible for Benghazi, that Obama and Hillary not only supported ISIS, but actually founded that group, and that all of this would be proven by Hillary's emails. From there, everything else gets pulled into the narrative. Coastal elites and the establishment selling out the American people to the 1%, fake news media hiding the truth, not being able to speak out against wetbacks, niggers, or even say Merry Christmas because of political correctness. But then the facts come in. The principal reason why well-paid manufacturing and mining jobs are disappearing is automation, and undocumented migrants and slave labour in countries such as China are doing jobs that Americans refuse to do for wages which they consider to be a crime. Obama deported more undocumented migrants than any other president in American history, specifically targeting those with serious criminal records, and the US has one of the most stringent refugee vetting procedures on earth. Regardless of whether they're undocumented or otherwise, immigrants commit far fewer crimes than native-born citizens. In spite of being almost 10 times more likely to be imprisoned or executed, people of colour are no more likely to commit crimes than white people. Far from marijuana being a gateway drug, the cause of the opioid epidemic in the US was profiteering drug companies giving out opioids like candy on Halloween before the law was finally changed to make it harder to receive prescription opioids, forcing addicts to turn to heroin instead, which, thanks ironically to the war on drugs, was everywhere and far cheaper, causing the number of heroin-related deaths to triple. Every accusation ever made against Obama has now long since been proven to be false. In spite of being investigated by the FBI twice and Congress repeatedly, no evidence of any wrongdoing has ever been found incriminating Hillary Clinton, and as I mentioned before, now that Hillary has been defeated and thus the reason for calling her a criminal has ceased to exist, neither Trump nor Republicans in Congress give a flying fig about these supposed crimes against the American people any longer. But should someone find themselves emotionally invested in that narrative, it's easy to come up with explanations for why the theory doesn't have any evidence or legs, going back to the table analogy, that this is merely what the corporations and their news media puppets want us to think. Fake news! Wake up, sheeple! James Comey just didn't want to be assassinated in the same way that Vince Foster was. It doesn't matter if any argument is contradictory because they're all entirely interchangeable. Disprove one and it'll be switched for another. This is how a conspiracy theory works. A theory supported by theories, where the value of a given theory is not does it hold up to scrutiny, but does it lead to the pre-chosen conclusion and tell me what I want to hear. We can't trust these facts because we know that the mainstream media and politicians are all liars. How do we know? Because of the truth, in inverted commas, which we are desperate to believe, but that these facts would disprove. It's pointing and saying, you can't tell me it doesn't have legs. I know it has legs, because it's a table, and tables always have legs, when most people would say it's just a plank of wood. The problem for most Trump voters in the second group was just how desperately they wanted that plank of wood to be a table. They saw communities declining for decades after factories closed long before NAFTA had ever been signed, let alone before Obama had come into power, and desperately wanted to believe that Mexico or China, immigrants, Muslims, feminazis, liberals, or the corrupt political establishment as personified by crooked Hillary was somehow directly responsible. The world is changing around them, and most of them just want someone like Trump to reassure them that the problem is the people who are changing it, not them. What they wanted was to hang out with other angry people, regardless of whether it was online or in real life, telling them that being angry was the right way to be. What they wanted was a messiah, a saviour, and a warrior king who would change Washington, the media, and the economy with nothing more than a wave of his hand, with no thoughts as to exactly how they should be changed beyond empty and reductionist platitudes, let alone whether it was possible to change them at all, and to imprison the people who they didn't like. Nothing that would solve any actual systemic problems, just the symbolic gesture that says, we heard you, and you're right. The problem isn't you, it's them. What they wanted even more than for everything to magically become stable and comfortable for them and the people around them was lines between who they could and couldn't trust. Other politicians have been talking about the same issues for decades. However, Trump supporters only ever seem to want to have conversations with other Trump supporters. White supremacists, Klan members and neo-Nazis, online anti-feminist and anti-SJW abusers and harassers. Even if Trump voters in the second group didn't personally like them, they were part of the movement as well. Meanwhile, in spite of the fact that people accused Bernie of being no different from Trump, insisting that they both appeal to the same core demographic of angry, older white men, relatively few Bernie voters voted for Trump in the end after Hillary won the nomination, significantly undermining the core argument that it was about fighting for working people and opposing political corruption, not reactionary and regressive white supremacy. What the second group achieved, what they were brought in to make America great again to achieve, was to amplify everything that the first group, the core of the movement, did in their name, believing and spreading all of the conspiracy theories and Russian propaganda, shouting WikiLeaks and lock her up, or if such coarse behaviour was beneath them, simply reminding everyone at every available opportunity that you couldn't trust Hillary or the mainstream media because they had been bought off, and that now only Trump and his supporters had the courage to stand up to the establishment. If the goal of the core of Make America Great Again was to wrap bigotry in a political euphemism, then it was the second group's job to swallow and repeat that euphemism. That is what the alliance was for. The I'm not bigoted but second group is always a part of the plan. Now, I've been speaking in the past tense because Make America Great Again, the cultural event, is over. Trump voters may still believe that they're the good guys, girls and others, but it's become obvious to them that no one else will ever believe it as long as they continue supporting him. In fact, the second group has been jumping ship ever since Trump himself made it clear back in December that drain the swamp and lock her up were merely campaign slogans. More turned against him when Jeff Beauregard Sessions, your I do declare, promised to go after legalized weed, and now, regardless of whether they are ever able to pass through Congress or not, Trump's budget and bill to repeal and replace Obamacare have killed any illusion that he's fighting for the forgotten men and women of America stone dead. But unfortunately, Make America Great Again, the reactionary and regressive backlash hasn't slowed down in the slightest. In fact, it's progressing even faster at the state and local level, and one of the most horrifying things about the second group of I'm not bigoted buts and otherwise less committed Trump voters is that in most instances, the reason that they've now turned against Trump is that he slighted, offended, disappointed or betrayed them personally or threatened their own selfish interests, most notably by not locking up Hillary, threatening their weed and threatening to hike up their insurance premiums, assuming that they're still covered at all, and not because of any of the countless lines that Trump and his most fanatical supporters continue to cross every day. Although they may believe that the jury is still out on feminism, the very definition of an I'm not bigoted but is that at least in principle they condemn racism, and yet they were willing to apologise for, defend, or at the very least ignore the grotesque and blatant racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism and general white supremacy at the heart of Make America Great Again, insisting that in spite of Trump being endorsed by the former leader of the KKK and the current, at least at the time, leader of the American Nazi Party, that was the vocal minority on the fringes of the movement, and we shouldn't judge Trump himself or the rest of his supporters, specifically them, by their words, actions or beliefs. That is how thoroughly they embraced the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There was seemingly no philosophy horrible enough that they wouldn't align with it if it suited their purpose. Nowadays, of course, the second group has by and large left Make America Great Again, or if they're still teetering on the edge of leaving, the way that things are going, it's only a matter of time before they do, but far from being converted or having seen the light, they're still out there sulking about how unfair it is that everyone assumes they're racist, sexist, xenophobic and homophobic and so forth, simply because in their minds they want to protect their country and guarantee the rights and freedoms of strangers straight, white, cis people as well. And whenever the next reactionary and regressive white supremacist backlash framed as a legitimate reform movement comes along, they're going to go straight for that second group. They probably still have their email address and follow them on social media, and provided that they tell them what they want to hear, the second group will join back up in a heartbeat. Just as those who supported and even actively fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War were later painted as having simply chosen the wrong side and followed the wrong leaders, since Trump's victory, many media outlets have been desperately struggling to portray Trump voters as forgotten victims rather than willfully ignorant and self-serving opportunists at best, under the largely correct assumption that because their main concern is themselves and their own feelings, many of them probably voted for Trump out of spite after Hillary dared to insult them by calling them deplorables. But I hope by now it's clear just how important perception truly is, how much effort went into cultivating a given perception, and how much ground was lost when people stopped buying into it. Perception may not matter to the core of Make America Great Again or any other regressive and reactionary backlash, but it's the difference between Trump winning by fewer than 80,000 votes in total spread across 3 states, in spite of losing the popular vote by almost 3 million nationwide, and him being defeated by tens of millions. Because in regards to the second group of I'm not bigoted buts, perception is everything.